And joining us now on the debate in the nation's capital, Ann Golden, President and CEO at the Conference Board of Canada. And back here in studio, Martin Blake, Vice President with the Daniels Corporation. That's a private sector developer, also very much involved in affordable housing projects. Michael Shapcott, Director of Affordable Housing and Social Innovation at the Wellesley Institute. Joe Deschênes-Smith, Vice President of Partnerships with Home Ownership Alternatives. That's a nonprofit financial corporation. And we welcome back, of course, David Hulchanski, the author of The Three Cities Within Toronto. Good to have all of you gentlemen here in the studio, and it's good to see you again in Ottawa. I want to start by painting this picture that we started to talk about, David, about how unaffordable housing is in the province of Ontario. And Michael, let's put up the following graphic to get that done. Here's the tale of the tape. 141,000 households are on the waiting list for social housing in this province. That's up 9.6% from the year 2010 to the previous year. What's the split on who owns and who rents? 28% of Ontarians rent, 72% own their own homes. 45% of renters pay more than 30% of pre-tax income for shelter, and 8,500 Ontarians use shelters daily, 8,500. Those are some of the numbers. Michael Shapcott, get us started. What do those numbers say to you? Paint us the picture.
Well, first of all, the numbers are staggering, and when you look at them over time, as David has done in his Three Cities research, what you see is that the trends are all going in the wrong direction. That is to say, they're growing. But what we then begin to have to ask is, what's the impact of this on people's lives? We know that there's a direct relationship between poor housing and poor health. So when you ask where are the sickest neighborhoods in cities, or the poorest neighborhoods in cities, we know that there's a direct relationship in terms of low income and health as well. And so you begin to see this toxic mix coming together and really has a profound impact on people's lives. That's really the story behind all these numbers.
And what do the numbers say to you?
Oh, they say certainly the problem is getting worse. When I looked at this 12 years ago, Steve, the numbers were significant, but they've gone up since we did our study. This is a problem that can be solved. And we haven't done what has to be done to solve the problem. So to me, it's really a shame. We see the problem getting worse. I agree with what Michael has said.
Joe, we're going to talk about some solutions during the course of the problem, but first let's make sure we understand the nature of the problem. What do those numbers say to you?
Yeah, I think, a lot of the numbers can be cut a lot of different ways. So you think about the growing waiting list, and it has gone up, but there aren't really any controls on who goes on the list, and it's pretty loose on how it's applied. And actually, if you looked at the criteria, the number could be many, many times higher. And then the question becomes, well then, are those people in good housing now, yes or no? And today's report from the United Way talked about, the towers in Toronto, the rental towers, and they're not in the state that they should be.
They're falling apart is what they said.
Well, yeah, so, is there good quality housing, and what's the best way to move forward, I think is what our organization wants to talk about.
Martin, I know that, for as long as these numbers have been around, they always seem to be going up, and it always seems to be somebody saying that this is a national tragedy, that we've got so many people on a waiting list. Yeah. Joe seems to be suggesting those numbers may not be telling the full story or may not be completely accurate. What's your understanding of it?
Certainly we'd see that there are a lot of people who are looking for housing. I mean, it's a right that we should be trying to fulfill. I think that there's a lot out there that we could be doing, though. And I think that's one of the things that we're here talking about today is, what can we be doing in that private sector, partnerships, all those different things to address the issue.
David, what do you think the numbers say?
The numbers are just indicators, right? We have this severe problem of housing, as we all know, is the most expensive item in a family's budget. But what's happening to people's budgets? So the house prices have far outpaced inflation, and incomes have not kept up for so many people. And then that's the gap. So then we start using that term affordable housing in recent times, because more and more people in society just can't afford the average basic house or apartment.
Well, Michael, let me ask this question then. Real simple. If you can't afford the home you're in, why don't you move to a less expensive home?
Well, that's of course what many people do, and that's part of the downward spiral. We have, for instance, in Ontario, to sort of the most dramatic numbers about people who can't afford their homes, or the people who get evicted because they can't pay the rent. We're talking 65, 70,000 households a year in Ontario who get evicted. What happens when you get evicted is some people, about a third, are able to find a less expensive place, but many of them end up right in the homeless shelters, or they end up living with family and friends in overcrowded conditions. So what's sort of behind some of these numbers and what's really hidden, one of the things we tried to do a year or so ago when we came out with our report called Precarious Housing in Canada was to sort of talk about some of those hidden realities, that 2 or 3 families that are living behind one door in some of the high-rises in Toronto and other areas because they just simply can't afford their own place. So people are doing a lot of things to maintain a roof over their heads, including things that aren't really all that good for them, aren't really all that healthy for them.
And that report you just referred to, we've got on our website, tvo.org/theagenda, if people want to consult it and read more. I don't, this is going to sound insensitive. I don't mean it to sound insensitive. And Anne, let me bring you in on this one. Not everybody's entitled to live in a $26 million mansion on the bridle path. Having said that, nobody wants to see anybody living in the streets. So somewhere in the middle is the right balance, right? Where is that balance? What are people entitled to?
We're not close to the balance, Steve. Just to look at, and it is linked not just to people who are in inadequate housing. The story today of the United Way report pointing to poverty in the high-rise towers, but you also still are dealing with homelessness, which is a topic I had hoped we would solve 12 years ago. You've got 150,000 people by the Conference Board estimates currently homeless or in shelters, right? You've got 25% of the population paying more than 30% of their income on housing, which means they're taking it away from other things that they need, be it food or education or whatever. So we're nowhere close to a balance. And the issues are, and also we haven't made the point, it's not just affordable housing, but also supportive housing, because many of the people who are in precarious situations have issues, mental health issues, addiction issues, etc. So there's a broad picture here. And I think the problem is well known. I think we know what we have to do. We've just never done it. We've never created or built the supportive housing, that is housing with supports for those who need help to exist on a day-to-day basis, and affordable housing that keeps that people whose incomes are rising more slowly than shelter costs. We have not created and built that housing, and we could.
Joe, is this a question of supply and demand?
Oh, for sure. I mean, and one of the issues that we'll talk probably in more detail is how do you supply the supportive housing and the low-cost rental housing? Where do you get the money from? It's a real tough nut to crack, because governments, especially here in Ontario right now, are facing big deficits, and the traditional models we've looked at in the past have taken a lot of money to build the housing and support it on a long-term basis.
Okay, but Martin, you're a private sector developer, right? Daniels Corp is a private sector group.
We are indeed.
Can you guys, when there's a market out there, you try to fill it? Somebody wants to buy a house, you want to build it for them, there's the match.
Absolutely.
Why does that formula not work in social housing?
Well, you're talking about a couple of things there. I mean, what you're talking about is trying to supply and demand. So there's a huge demand out there, and I think that the private sector will be able to certainly come forward and be able to fulfill that supply requirement. But it's finding the programs that will be able to help them create that for them. And I think right now that the report from the Ontario government on how they're looking at affordable ownership or affordable housing within Ontario and gives a guideline of what they're going to, but it perhaps doesn't address the problems in delivering it.
David?
So there's a nice distinction in what you just said we should make. There's market demand and there's social need. Yeah. Effective market demand. So people who need housing, those people who need housing, cannot, that's where the word afford comes in, right? Don't have the money or don't qualify for a mortgage. And that's the problem. So we have more and more people in the category of social need than in the category of generating effective market demand that Daniels and other such builders can meet.
But let me get back, Michael, to first principles here, which again, this is an absurd example to use, but not everybody can live on the bridle path and no one needs to be living in the streets, right? Mm-hmm. So what are people entitled to?
Well, people are entitled to some basics. What you need for good health is you need access to basic shelter, you need the sanitary facilities and so on. The United Nations has a definition of adequate affordable housing that includes the kind of basics. One thing I think that's really important, Steve, to say, and I'd actually go back to when Anne Golden did her housing and homelessness report way back last century. Not wanting to age.
1998, I think, or something?
Now, in the time since then, things have gotten worse, but it's not because we didn't build any housing. We in fact, in a number of those years between now and then, we've been building tons of housing, but we're just not building housing that's affordable to low-income people. And we go back to the money issue. People who have middle or upper incomes, they can afford to go into either the private rental market or into the private ownership market. They can find a home. And generally speaking, in the last decade, with a few little bits and upsets here and there, the private markets have delivered good quality, affordable housing to people that have money. The problem is, how do you deliver housing to people that don't have money? And in the old days, we used to have a government housing program that would provide capital subsidies. That fell by the wayside. It was canceled for all sorts of reasons. And so the fundamental issue now is, how do we get money into the hands of people who want to build housing for people who can't afford to get into the private markets?
Joe, a follow-up?
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, there's lots of builders who want to build housing for every segment of the population, but there's some structural things that we have in Ontario that just dissuade them from doing it. So you have planning approvals for a set size of a building, and it doesn't matter whether you build a building that's luxurious or not, and then they crunch the numbers and figure out what's economic. You have development charges and other fees that are regressive. So it's, in Toronto, it's about $35,000 a unit. Doesn't matter if I'm financing a project and we're selling the unit for $200,000, a condo at, you know, Don Lands and Cosburn, or if Donald Trump is financing the unit and building it downtown and it costs $1 million a unit. It's still $35,000. So,
are you saying
you
that
know, so if those structural things could be addressed, governments need the money to build the infrastructure and all those things. But if they took away the regressive nature of those charges, they could go a long way to encourage us and Daniel's Group and other builders to build in that lower end of the market to help support the families that need to get the quality housing.
Let me just understand that. Martin, if they took these development charges and lot levies and all this kind of stuff off, if you said, I'm going to build this project and people who make $20,000 a year or $30,000 a year get to live here, get first crack at these homes, could you then do it?
Well, we have done it, and you know, I would certainly agree with what you're saying, that if you can reduce the costs that go into housing, you're definitely going to be able to improve the affordability of it. But there are programs in place, and in fact, you know, we've been working through the Ontario Affordable Housing Program, Canada-Ontario Affordable Housing Program, since 2005, and we've delivered affordable ownership to people. And you know, one of the great things about affordable ownership is actually a 2-for-1 special, because every time we deliver that new ownership unit, we're actually freeing up an existing rental stock, which is great because, you know, through what the conference board has said, is it's almost impossible to build new rental today and make it economically viable. So I think there's a huge opportunity for ownership, affordable ownership, to take that chunk of those people who are looking for homes today and bring it back in.
And again, let me go back to first principles here with you.
Yeah.
Why does the government, I hear what everybody's saying here, but there are going to be some people watching this program saying, why does the government need to be in the housing business at all? What's the answer to that?
Number one, the market does not work for the poor. That point has been made in various ways on the program already. The market does not work, and there is a gap between what it costs to produce housing, including the various development charges and all the things that go into it, property taxes, different things, what it costs to produce the housing, plus a reasonable profit for the developer, and what people whose income has been rising more slowly than shelter costs have been rising can afford to pay. And we're talking a quarter of the population, 20%, 1 in 5 who do not get any assistance, but who are below the standard that is accepted, the 1/3, the 30% of your income standard. And that doesn't even take account of, by the way, the decrepit housing issues raised today by the United Way report. So the market does not work, point one. Point two, to close that gap, there are a variety of mechanisms and tools, and there's no single formula. In a report we did last year at the conference board called From the Ground Up, we set out a number of tools that could be used. So there are various incentives you can use. Density bonusing, zoning inclusion, which are requirements. You can have shelter allowances, and you have to balance that with rent supplements. You don't want to just do shelter allowances or it'll push up the price of housing. You can look at removal of sales tax from building supplies. There's a whole number of things that you can do, and people know what those things are. So the issue is, why haven't we done it? And that's because, and I want to go back to the point made, this will be my last point, that it's so expensive. Indeed it is. When we crunched the numbers 12 years ago, not so long ago.
Last century.
It was about last century.
Last millennium, actually.
We estimated it would be about $1 billion to address the problem as it then existed in a major way. Okay, $1 billion, that's a lot of money. But we spent more than that on the security for the recent G20. We've spent double that on a gun registry. We're spending a lot more, on military hardware or the war. All important things. But it's not that we aren't spending money on things in this country. We just haven't made the commitment to put a national strategy in place that involves all 3 levels of government, which, by the way, is a trick for Canada to get all the levels of government working together. And we just haven't done it.
Well, but you say, I'm going to follow up with David on this one. She says $1 billion and we could have had this thing nailed. But the problem is, people pick up the paper and they read stories about an attempt to build, for example, a shelter in downtown Toronto, which is a thing is going way over budget and way past deadlines and so on. So $1 billion for that suddenly becomes $2 or $3 billion. No, I'm not sure there's a lot of confidence in government's ability to bring this in on time and on budget. Isn't that a fair problem?
Well, no, I don't think so. There's
that's not a legitimate concern for people?
Yes, it's easy to pick on some particular project that costs a lot of money, and that can be done any place throughout society in any sector, frankly, health, education, you name it, you can find waste or mistakes or whatever, cost overruns. We are a wealthy society, a very wealthy society, but we've had 20 years of saying and acting and voting, voters, right, of smaller government, cut my taxes, don't mention raising taxes and all that. Up until 1984, the federal government and the provincial government subsidized most rental housing was built. There were a variety of programs for the private sector. MERB's assisted rental program, the Canada Rental Supply program. There are a whole bunch of programs that assisted homeowners, assisted homeownership program and so on through the years. And then there was a social housing program at the federal level until 1993 and Ontario until 1995. We were able to do that.
But the Harris government got out of it because they said nobody can bring in these projects on time and on budget.
Well, that's
they said they don't want to be in it anymore.
Well, that was a claim, but that's not true because we were successfully doing it for 2 decades.
Absolutely.
Okay? We're successfully doing all that for 2 decades. And it's not the nonprofit sector building it. It's Daniels and other contractors building it, and they know what they're doing, right?
Okay, let's go to Michael on this one. The Ontario government has unveiled a new, relatively new affordable housing strategy. Let's just pick that apart a little bit and see if that's going to work. Generally speaking, broad stroke principles here, what are they trying to do?
Well, the strategy is supposed to address the long-term affordable housing needs of the province. What they've actually delivered is one very big piece of legislation to replace the Social Housing Reform Act. This is a piece of punitive legislation from the Harris era that sets rents in subsidized housing projects. It was a terrible piece of legislation. The rules were extremely harsh. You know that there was a while back a tenant in Toronto, an elderly man who was evicted inadvertently because his income actually went up by a few dollars. He was living on old age security. He neglected to tell that to the authorities. He was evicted. He died. So everyone knows that the rules have to be changed for the Social Housing Reform Act has to be brought into the 21st century. That's the major piece of work they've done there. What the big yawning gaps in the long-term affordable housing strategy are any kind of housing strategy. There's no funding, there's no new funding attached to it. By the end of this fiscal year, March 31st, 2011, there's going to be a giant sucking sound because the federal provincial affordable housing program, which Martin has talked about, is a program that's going to be substantially wound down. Some of the big money that was put in starting in 2009 is drying up. So we're in fact at a time when we need more urgently than ever both significant investment by the federal government, but new policies and programs. What they've delivered mainly are some changes to the way that rents are calculated in subsidized housing. It's not good enough.
Joe, do you think the provincial new strategy is as bleak as he suggests?
I would have liked to see more innovation in it, and that's our business model is innovative. Certainly, it addressed, I think, one of the most important issues that are out there, and that's with the that Social Housing Reform Act from 10 years ago. And that was a big issue for my friends in the Ontario Nonprofit Association and the co-op sector, and moving that forward. I think Minister Duncan is going to come out with a budget in 8 or 10 weeks, and we need to see the other boot drop, right?
What's
we need
the other boot?
Well, some money. right?
He's working on reducing an $18 billion deficit.
I know.
How much more money do you think there's going to be?
I think that's the challenge, and I think that's where, innovative stuff that Martin and I are doing and suggesting that he do more of should come to the fore. We've got a couple of developments that we went to the Infrastructure Ontario, which is their infrastructure funding agency. We were able to save $10,000 a unit on our financing costs by leveraging support from that agency. They could do a lot more of that type of thing that doesn't increase their capital expenditures, it doesn't increase their operating expenditures. It just leverages the dollars that they can access on the market because they're big.
Let me go to Ann on this one, because in the capital of the country right now, Ann, there's a bill before Parliament, C-304, that a new Democrat member's put forward that would get the federal government, I guess, back in the business of being in social housing, which this current government, I gather, has been trying to get out of, and maybe out of entirely within a decade or so. What can you tell us about that bill, its prospects, or whether you think it's any good?
I'm not an expert on that bill. I just wanted to go back to the Ontario legislation, because I think it does two things. I think you're right. It does very little to address the broad supply issue, but there's two things in addition to what's been mentioned on the process side that is noteworthy. One would be the elimination of the requirement that if you have any assets at all, you can't be eligible for assistance. I think that's an important change if the legislation does that. And I think the provision for second suites and garden suites can add somewhat to the supply. So I think there's some positive things there, but we don't have a major supply strategy at the federal level. We have been out of the federal government did decide back in the mid-90s to get out of the housing business, and there have been a whole series of reports. I think of Art Eggleton's report in the Senate, Judy Scrow to Prime Minister Craig Chen, all advocating that the federal government get back in. But we are in an era of fiscal restraint now, legitimately because of the stimulus spending, and I think that's a real challenge to get the government interested in coming back in.
Martin Blake,
and
do you think there's a role?
It's all governments.
Mm-hmm. Is there a role for the federal government in housing in this country?
I actually prefer to see more of a coordination between the provincial and municipal level. We talk about housing, it's delivering units. And certainly the challenges that we go through when we're trying to do that is trying to get everyone on board at the same time. And I think that the Ontario plan, which talked about the partnerships and creating partnerships, is great. It talked about nonprofit and those types of things, but there wasn't much talking about the development industry, the actual private development industry. And I think here you have this wonderful infrastructure already in place that can actually bring forward the housing that we're looking to do. But the challenges that we end up with when we're trying to create this is how do we get all these people on the same page at the same time?
Well, let me follow up with Michael on that. That's an interesting point, because everybody you talk to in your business, guys, says we need all three levels of government involved in this. We need the federal government to get back to the table, as they were in the Paul Martin days when John Godfrey was the minister and manna rained down from heaven. Except I also hear people saying it's impossible to get all three levels of government singing out of the same hymn book on this. Yeah. So would it be better if the federal government, in fact, vacated the social housing field and just let the other guys worry about it and get it done that way?
Well, Steve, in terms of it being impossible, there actually are places in the world that have been blessed with the same form of federal parliamentary government as Canada that have figured it out. One is Australia. They've had a state Commonwealth affordable housing agreement since I think 45 or 46. It gets renewed every 2 or 3 years. They put money in.
Is that 3 levels or just 2?
It is 3 levels. The 3 levels of government. The national government and the state governments in Australia are similar to our provinces, and the municipal governments also join in. It's primarily a funding arrangement.
We don't seem to do that well.
Well, in Canada, we have had some times when there's actually been better federal, provincial, territorial, municipal cooperation than what we've had in the last little while. But one of the things we have had, Anne mentioned that in 1996, the federal government decided that it was going to get out of the housing business, transfer most of its housing programs to the provinces and territories. But in 2001, the federal government signed the Affordable Housing Framework Agreement with the provinces and territories. Everybody signed up to that. That was initially a 5-year program. It's extended to almost 10 years. In 2006, we had another federal provincial program, which a couple of provinces, including Ontario, initially balked at, but eventually got on board. So I think there actually is some initiative. And one final thing I'd say to you, Steve, was that back in February of 2009, Canada stood up in front of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is the highest human rights body in the UN system. We were being reviewed for our performance under various international agreements, including the various agreements on right to housing. And one of the things Canada stood up and said, our ambassador said in front of the entire United Nations Human Rights Council was, yes, the federal government is committed to working with the provinces and territories to solve this problem. So Canada, the federal government says in one forum it will do it. They come back to here and they say, sorry, we're not going to do it.
Joe.
Everyone here is going to say we should have a national housing strategy, but we got to deal also with kind of real politics, right? Is this government in a minority situation going to deliver that? I don't think so. I mean, we made a submission to the federal budget saying, okay, you introduced a tax credit 2 years ago for home buyers. It's very modest. Why don't you target it to low-income families? And why don't you target it to affordable new buildings and enrich it for that specific purpose? So you do two things. You're helping buyers, you're expanding the market, and you're signaling to the development industry, build at this type of product, and we'll support you. You know, they control CMHC. It's a giant federal agency. It's big business that sells insurance to all the developments in the province. When they do the insurance assessment, quite frankly, they don't really look at whether the development is an affordable project or if it's a standard for-profit development. Could they do some of that within the agencies they have and the roles they have? Yes, they could quite easily, and I think it could be effective to move the bars forward on getting more affordable units built.
David, I'm not sure though why this wouldn't pass the Parliament. You may have a Conservative government that believes in smaller government and less of a role. A lot of Conservatives out there don't think they're that conservative, actually, but you've got a Liberal Party that is in favor of social housing. Democrats clearly are. The Bloc at the moment is blocking this bill probably because there's not enough for Quebec in it, but if there were enough for Quebec in it, they'd be on side too. That's the majority of the House of Commons right there. So why isn't there support?
Money and pointing fingers. So if there isn't political will of the government of the day, it's not going to happen. What Joe just mentioned is quite interesting because that's one example of 20 or 30 things just a few of us could think of off the top of our heads that can be done. No one of them makes a huge difference. But each one of them helps out some segment and lowers the bar that is reaching more people that need it. But we can't get away from the fact that housing is expensive. There's no cheap way of building it. And the federal government is where the best tax base is. So I've always favored the federal government doing the heavy lifting, if you will, on the bricks and mortar side of subsidies. And the provinces have the constitutional jurisdiction for welfare and social assistance and all that, and they handle the rent supplement and the income support for people who need housing and some kind of shared arrangement like that. But I don't think we will get any place without a federal role. And as I mentioned earlier, the federal government was involved in all sectors, and that's why we built a pretty decent housing system after World War II. We were making progress in building a good housing system, and now it's all those numbers that you open this segment with. That shouldn't be in a country like this.
Martin.
Yeah, just listening to what Joe's saying and thinking about the development industry and delivering on what's required, which is housing, it's very difficult for the development industry to work within a constantly changing framework.
What does that mean?
Well, you know, there's this program this year, and next year there's this program, and you know, we've worked on programs where we're actually delivering affordable housing, and we're doing that now, but we have this tight time frame. Unless we get everything done by this certain date, it's all done, it's all over, we can't access any funds. Well, development doesn't act like, it doesn't work that way.
So why do they bring in programs that are not like what the market needs?
Well, I think the programs could be worked properly, and they could work, but the problem is you can't just put a time frame of, well, by March 31st, by the end of this fiscal year, this program is over. And because, you know, we end up with environmental issues on a piece of land. Well, it's going to take a little bit longer. Well, does that mean that we then shouldn't go forward with this building? You know, I'm sure Joe goes through the same thing all the time. There's risk involved. We have to know, we have to have certainty that there's a program in place that we can access so that we can bring affordable housing to the market.
But that was true yesterday, that was true 25 years ago. How is it possible that these levels of government can't get that figured out?
I wish I knew.
Anne thinks she knows. Go ahead, Anne. Explain.
Well, just two more arguments in favor of federal engagement on this. The one is, think what our housing would have been like if we hadn't had, say, going back to the 70s, a limited dividend policy, and if we hadn't had the incentives in the 80s. So historically, we've made progress. You know, the federal government got involved back in the, I think it was the 40s. No, maybe the 30s as a result of the Depression. And then the provinces got involved. I mean, our record historically, the feds have been very important. Secondly, look at the fiscal reality in Canada right now. Yes, the federal government has a deficit, but the federal government's in better shape than most of the provinces. So if we really want to address the issue, I do think at the federal level also they have the levers, several of the levers. So I do think you have to have you have to have engagement of all three levels and ideally alignment.
Okay, but for better or for worse, there is a government in power in the country right now that doesn't think that the federal government ought to have its nose in every single file in this country. And they look at the Constitution and they see housing as a provincial responsibility. So what case can you make to the federal government today that would make them think, you know what, we're just going to ignore the Constitution and we're going to do this anyway? What's the argument there, Anne?
I would make the argument on the basis of the need for strong and healthy cities for a competitive Canada.
But cities, again, is not a federal responsibility, it's a provincial one.
Well, but I do think, in fact, I just read the headlines yesterday that the government is interested increasingly in appealing to urban voters. But it's a national issue. It's not about cities. Canada's competitive now, with 80% of us living in cities, and with the role that the major cities have in terms of 2/3 of GDP, you have to pay attention to what's happening in cities. And the two issues of transportation infrastructure and housing infrastructure are critical from 2 points of view. As an aging society, we're going to be short of labor. I know there's a blip right now because of the recession, but we're going to be short of labor, and it isn't good when you have 1/5 of your population suffering and having difficulty making a go of it because of these pressures, for the health costs and everything else. And secondly, when we want to attract investment and people to this country, which everybody agrees we want to do, you really want to have livable cities. So I would appeal on those grounds, Steve.
Gotcha. David and then Michael.
See, and Anne mentioned appealing to voters. I always ask in my housing courses, why do Western European nations do way better than we do? The numbers you rhymed off aren't like that in most Western European countries.
So they have more government commitment, they have fewer people on waiting lists,
and
all
why?
that stuff.
And why?
What's the answer?
And it's appealing to voters. They have proportional representation outside of England, outside of the UK. Okay? They have proportional representation. More voices at the table in the Parliament. Okay? 40%. Winning 40% of the vote isn't good enough to have a majority in government.
Okay, but we don't have PR here, and we're not going to before the next election or the one after that.
We have to talk about it, and see, because you're asking a great question. Here we are, 30 or 40 years after. You know, this is the same discussion for at least 20 years now. Okay, and it has to do with the fact that so many people in Canada are indeed very well housed. Okay, the majority are very well housed. It's just that there's an increasing minority that are everything that we just talked about. That's number one. And number two, how do you generate political will in our 19th century electoral system for something like that? And they do it in Europe, but we don't manage it here.
Michael.
You mentioned C-304, the federal legislation. Just before Christmas, there was a vote in the Commons, and the majority of members of Parliament from all the political parties except the Conservative Party did in fact support it.
I think one Conservative voted for it.
One Conservative did vote for it, and that was kind of interesting. It's coming. It's going to go to committee, come back onto the floor. I'm reasonably confident, if this Parliament has any life left in it, that it will actually pass through the life. Then, of course, has to go through the Senate, which these days is a bit of a minefield as well. But
what would it mean if it passed?
It would first of all be a big stick. What the legislation says, stripping away all the language, is it basically says the federal government has 180 days to report back to Parliament on a national housing plan. It has to consult with the provinces, territories, Aboriginal people, the business sector, nonprofit sector, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, it's saying to the federal government, go out there, do your work, come back and give us a national housing plan. You mentioned that about housing in the Constitution. I'm sorry to have to correct you, Stephen. The word housing doesn't actually appear in Canada's Constitution.
The word housing does not. Okay, no. So what's the language?
It was in the Charlottetown Accord, which we all remember was actually defeated by the voters. Yes. There's the word property rights is in, and that
people have inferred over the years.
People have sort of done that, but I do want to say about this current federal government under Prime Minister Harper since 2006, they've actually put more money into affordable housing programs than the Liberal government did in the previous decade, which is kind of interesting. And why did they do that? Exactly the reason David mentioned. It's the politics. In 2006, they put $1.7 billion into affordable housing programs over a 3-year period. In 2009,
well, they needed the NDP to support their budgets.
They needed political support. It's the way minority governments work, and also they know that out there in the communities, in places like Calgary, the heartland of conservative support, apparently according to today's polls, the people are having among the worst housing crisis anywhere in the country. So these programs are not just simply ones for downtown Toronto. They're programs right across the country.
Joe?
They also did it because it's a great economic stimulus. So when you put $1 into housing, A, it stays in the jurisdiction because your manufacturers are local, you get your cement locally, all the other things, and it has great spin-off effects. 10,000 units of housing is about $3 billion worth of economic activity.
Can't you say that for everything? You put that dollar into a new car manufacturing plant, or you put that dollar into higher
Where do the
EI
parts
rates?
come from? The auto plant, from Japan, from the US, from Mexico, from Brazil.
From
But when you're building a
from
house, the
Waterloo,
wood comes from outside of my hometown of North Bay, and the cement is from a quarry up near Orangeville, right? And the people are working here in the GTA.
You're saying it's a better bang for the buck.
Better bang for the duck, and that's why they had it in the stimulus.
Okay, Martin?
It's an absolute great bang for the buck because that dollar of public tax money will never be lost. And the wonderful thing about that is obviously, so we're going in there, and Joe and companies like myself, Daniels are going out, we're creating these homes. People are coming off the rental stock, which means we've freed up rental stock. And that money will be recycled as when people have paid off their second mortgage back into new affordable housing.
Well,
so it'll be there, and it'll just keep recycling and recycling.
Let me ask a heretical question then, which is, if you guys have got all these brilliant ideas, and if the logic behind all of these brilliant ideas is so overwhelmingly compelling, why hasn't it happened in 25 years? We've had this, I've done this program on the agenda. I did it on Studio 2, I did it at CBC when I used to work there. I've always done this program. We talk about the same things all the time. So what gives? Joe, what gives?
I guess we're the new kid on the block, and my model and the way we finance projects has only really been around 10 years. So not quite the 25 that you're talking about, Steve. And I think we are starting to get some traction. You know, in Ontario, they talked about introducing innovative financing tools. Haven't seen much yet, but they're talking about it. You know, I know Michael does a lot of work on social finance stuff that's growing in our province, and I think that the province is starting to get that that's an area that we can link into housing and get some real impact that way as well. And they're starting to put some support there.
And what about
but
it? If this is so bloody obvious, the solution in front of everybody's faces, why doesn't it happen?
This is a question I've asked myself many times, and I actually don't know the answer because, and I spent a lot of time on this, Steve. Going back a decade, when I thought that we really had the support, and we did a lot of private diplomacy. We thought we had the support for it. The result was a rather, it was not unhelpful, but it was an anemic Skippy program that did some good work in the shelters and a few things. But we never really embraced the big challenge. I'm not sure why we don't. It just in the end didn't make it as the priority, and maybe it just the political will. I actually don't know, because I think it's such the right thing to do, and I think you've got health and economic arguments in favor of it, all of which have just been made. So the truth is, I don't know. I don't get it.
Michael?
2 words: politics and money. You started earlier on, you were talking about the smear job that was done on affordable housing back in the 1990s. The $1 billion boondoggle, I even sort of gag thinking about it, but it was a brilliant job of trying to justify a political decision, which was to pull out of investment in affordable housing. And it was a manufactured a smear job. There weren't people that were ripping off the system and all that sort of stuff, but it stuck, and it continues to stick now. So politics continues to be one of the big issues. The other is money. We're in an era, we have been in an era for maybe 20 years federally, maybe at least 10, 15 years provincially, where the trend is little government, smaller government, cut. And there, as we've discussed, there's no way you can do housing without having some money. Now, that doesn't always mean that you have to have big budgets, because as Joe mentioned, one of the brilliant innovations that hasn't been used as well as it should be is the Infrastructure Ontario Affordable Housing Loan Program, where they're actually creating money. They're going out and selling bonds, they're creating money, and then lending it out for affordable housing. So there are ways to get around the money problem, but we're in an era where the minute you say to politicians, we want to do something and it's going to cost $1, then their ears close.
Okay, but just off the top of my head, David, when the government wanted to make sure that auto companies and auto jobs didn't go down the toilet, Suddenly they found $3.5 billion to go do that, right? And when they wanted to attract, when the McGuinty government wanted to attract a state-of-the-art video game manufacturer to the waterfront here, suddenly there's $250 million for a subsidy there and for auto parts, et cetera, et cetera. How come that money's there for that and it's not there for housing?
My answer, I'll repeat very briefly, our electoral system, they count heads, they count votes, right? Majority of people are well housed. And there isn't enough pressure on them to do that.
So as long as the majority of the people are well housed,
well,
the bottom 20%, tough.
See, the problem after the Depression, World War II, is the majority of people were not well housed, right? We shifted from that situation by the 70s to having a majority well housed and just having a minority left over, and that minority is now larger. We have to tackle that, and we don't get to pick the political climate in which we try to make the change that we're talking about. It's tougher today. Neoliberal ideology, don't raise our taxes.
David, she's giving me the hook. I gotta go.
Yep.
Ken, I thank our guest, Ann Golden, for being there in Ottawa for us in the Conference Board of Canada, and as always, thanks for being on the program. And here in our studios back in Toronto, David Hulchansky from the University of Toronto, Michael Shapcott from the Wellesley Institute, and on the other side of the table, Joe Duchesne-Smith from Home Ownership Alternatives and Martin Blake from the Daniels Corporation. Thanks so much, guys, for being on the program today. Thank you.